At the end of World War I, the United States Navy had almost 500,000 officers and enlisted men and women, and in terms of personnel was the largest in the world. Younger officers were enthusiastic about the potential of land-based naval aviation, as well as the potential roles of aircraft carriers. After a short period of demobilization, the major naval powers of the globe began programs to increase the size and number of their capital ships. The United States' first aircraft carrier, a converted collier named USS Langley, was commissioned in 1922 and was soon joined by the aircraft carriers USS Lexington and USS Saratoga. In the United States, the effect of the stock market crash of October 1929 drastically slowed naval developments and the expansion of the fleet. Research and development programs suffered, and the fleet drastically curtailed operations. The Naval Act of 1936 authorized the first new battleship since 1921, and USS North Carolina was laid down in October 1937. The Second Vinson Act authorized a 20% increase in the size of the Navy, and in June 1940, the Two-Ocean Navy Act authorized an 11% expansion of the fleet. Chief of Naval Operations Harold Rainsford Stark's request for an additional 70% increase was authorized by Congress in less than a month, for a total increase in fleet strength of around 200 new ships. In 1941, the U.S. Navy began building a fleet of large destroyers, its first designed to rival the Japanese special-type Fubuki class destroyers that had entered service more than a decade before. The Fletcher Class destroyers were authorized as part of the 1941-42 Shipbuilding Program. They incorporated many lessons learned from earlier classes of destroyers built during the 1930s and in the early stages of World War II, particularly those relating to stability and seaworthiness. During the 1930s, the Navy had produced a series of step-deck destroyer designs with raised focsles, but the Fletcher class reverted to a flush-deck design, like the destroyers of World War I. Most of the ships were assigned to the 7th Fleet and 3rd Fleet in the Pacific, where they were to play a major role in the fighting against Japan. These 175 flush-deck, 2,100-tonners became, in retrospect, the most successful of all American destroyers, fast, roomy, capable of absorbing enormous punishment and yet fighting on, according to the author of U.S. Destroyers, an illustrated design history. A total of 175 Fletcher-class destroyers were commissioned between June 4, 1942 and the 22nd of February 1945. The lead ship of the class was USS Fletcher, hull number DD-445. Hull numbers ranged between 445 and 691, plus an additional block between 792 and 804. The Fletcher-class ships were built in 11 different shipyards. Fletchers were much less top-heavy than previous classes, allowing them to take on additional equipment and weapons without major redesign. They were fortunate in catching American production at the right moment, becoming the destroyer design, and only Fletcher-class derivatives, the Sumner and Gearing classes, would follow it. The 4th of June 1942 was a significant day for the U.S. Navy. In the mid-Pacific, its carrier aircraft sank 4 of Japan's 6 frontline aircraft carriers, while turning back her invasion fleet at the Battle of Midway. Meanwhile, at nearly the same hour, 7 time zones to the east, the first 2,100-ton Fletcher-class destroyer was commissioned at the Boston Navy Yard. Their design was a fine achievement, balancing ruggedness and seaworthiness, armament, speed, and protection on a classically proportioned 376.5-foot-long flush-deck hull. At 2,050 tons standard displacement and approximately 2,900 tons fully loaded, the Fletchers were significantly larger than any class of American destroyer that came before it. Authorized for fiscal year 1941, construction of the first of the Fletchers was already underway when the United States entered the war. In an emergency program to expand capacity, some shipyards were upgraded and other new ones were brought online. Eventually, 11 shipyards launched 175 ships over the next 32 months, the most numerous class of destroyer completed by any navy in the world. They were also the first U.S. destroyers to be fitted with radar while under construction. Fletchers carried surface search, air search, and fire control radars. The surface search radar had a range out to the horizon, about 10 to 12 miles, while the air search could see out to about 40 to 45 miles. The fire control radar was used strictly for control of the 5-inch gun battery. The advent of radar resulted in the creation of a new shipboard space, Combat Information Center, CIC, or Combat for short. CIC soon evolved into the major nerve center for directing all surface, subsurface, and anti-air missile operations aboard U.S. Navy ships. The Fletcher's main battery consisted of 5 single-barreled dual-purpose surface action and anti-aircraft 5-inch 38 caliber gun mounts. 2 mounts were located forward and 3 aft. These mounts had a firing rate up to 18 rounds per minute. Effective range was 17,306 yards at 45 degrees elevation and an altitude of 32,250 feet at 85 degrees elevation. The ship's design incorporated 10 torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple centerline mounts, numerous 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft mounts, and nearly 24 after-deck rack-mounted depth charges. Possibly the best illustration of the rugged construction of the class was the Battle of SAMAR, one of the many parts of the Battle for Leyte Gulf. Regarded as the largest naval battle of World War II and considered by many as the largest naval battle in history, involving over 200,000 men. Fought in waters near and around the Philippine islands of Leyte, Samar, and Luzon from the 23rd to the 26th of October 1944, between combined American and Australian forces and the Imperial Japanese Navy. The battle was part of the invasion of Leyte, which aimed to isolate Japan from the territories it had occupied in Southeast Asia, that were a vital source of Imperial Japan's industrial raw materials and oil supplies. In this action, the Japanese main fleet found the American escort carrier group off the invasion beaches of Leyte, guarded only by 3 Fletchers and 4 destroyer escorts. It was a one-sided battle from the start, and should have resulted in all the escort carriers being sent to the bottom, but the battle turned out otherwise. In what can only be described as one of the classic destroyer actions in naval history, the 3 Fletchers attacked the Japanese battle fleet. 2 of the 3 destroyers were sunk, but not until they had inflicted serious damage on their opponents. USS Hull was the first to go down after suffering 44 direct hits, from shells ranging in size from 5-inch to 14-inch. Hit at 07:28 on the morning of the October 25, 1945, Hull stayed afloat and in the fight until 08:55. USS Johnston was hit by 3 14-inch shells just as she launched a torpedo spread at 07:20. This was followed in rapid succession by direct hits by 3 6-inch shells, slowing the ship to 17 knots. From then on, she was a sitting duck, but didn't slip beneath the waves until 10:10. Casualties were indeed heavy. Out of a crew of 285, USS Johnston lost 101 wounded and 184 dead, including its captain, Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans, the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive the Medal of Honor. USS Hull lost all but 86 of her men, with 253 killed aboard ship and a further 40 men perishing in the sea before rescue could arrive. Interestingly, 75 years after that turning point in the Pacific Theater, a private underwater expedition discovered the wreckage of one of the destroyers, which researchers believe to be the USS Johnston DD-557. Navy historians confirmed that the wreckage belonged to a Fletcher Class destroyer, but said that more research was needed before they could determine whether it was the Johnston or the Hull DD-533. But let's go back to the battle. To the destroyer's great credit, one Japanese cruiser, the Kumano, was stopped dead in the water by torpedoes from the Hull, and 2 other cruisers were badly damaged by gunfire. Miraculously, the Fletcher-class destroyer's brave actions over the course of the 2-hour battle forced the Japanese to break off contact and retreat, depriving Japan of what should have been an easy victory. Among the impressive Japanese battle fleet were 11 destroyers, 6 cruisers, and 4 battleships, including the super battleship Yamato, with its 3 triple-barrel turrets featuring 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval guns in the world. This massive force was put to flight by the determined attack of the brave crews of a handful of Fletcher-class destroyers. The Fletcher's design specifications included twin screws driven by a 60,000 horsepower oil-fired steam turbine propulsion plant that produced a maximum speed between 35 and 37 knots. Considered a very respectable level of power even in today's modern terms, the awesome power of Fletcher-class destroyers was achieved with 1930s-era technology. An environmentalist would look askance at ships of this era. All commodes and urinals discharged directly overboard. All sailors knew that standing orders permitted bilges to be discharged only at night when in port. When at sea, trash and garbage was disposed by being tossed overboard. The ships had to take on seawater ballast directly into the fuel tanks to maintain stability under light loading conditions, and deballasting operations at sea took several hours, during which the ballast tanks inevitably discharged a nasty-looking oil slick. Machinery spaces, firewalls, and bulkheads were heavily lined with asbestos fireproofing insulation. Living accommodations were nothing to brag about. Sailors were berthed by division in 4 high tiers of canvas bunks with separate upright lockers. The practice of placing portholes in the hull for ventilation had been done away with, and there was no air conditioning. The galley was on the main deck, and all food had to be carried on large trays down to the mess deck below. Fletcher-class destroyers had one major weakness. It was necessary to go outside on the weather deck in order to get from the forward to after parts of the ship. In dangerously heavy seas, during extra rough weather such as typhoons, one end of the ship was effectively cut off from the other. Retired Captain George Stewart recalls the heavy seas of Typhoon Cobra in December 1944. During the typhoon, our gunnery officer was nearly washed overboard when he had to go out on deck to ensure that the ship's depth charges were secured. He wound up hanging onto a lifeline. To get to the main engine control station, I had to go outside on the main deck and enter through a vestibule that led into the ship's laundry. I saw a large wave breaking over the ship, and I grabbed onto a valve hand wheel on the superstructure and held on tightly. I was submerged from head to foot. Later destroyer designs, including the Sumner and Gearing classes, incorporated an enclosed passageway inside the superstructure. By 1971, all Fletcher-class destroyers in service with the U.S. Navy had been decommissioned. But it was not until 2001 that the Mexican Navy's Cuitlahuac, the former USS John Rogers, and the last active Fletcher was retired from service. Despite talk of returning her to the United States as a museum ship, in 2010 she was condemned as a derelict and scrapped. 4 Fletchers have been preserved on public display. In Greece, the former USS Charette, renamed Velos, meaning arrow, is a popular attraction. In the United States, USS The Sullivans at Buffalo, New York. The USS Kidd, beautifully restored to late World War II configuration at Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And USS Cassin Young, berthed across the pier from the frigate USS Constitution at the Boston Navy Yard, Charleston, Massachusetts, are open to the public. The 1930s began quietly with an international treaty that extended previous agreements to reduce naval armaments. As the years passed, the peace dissipated, however, and the powers moved inexorably toward a second global war. A total of 19 Fletcher Class destroyers were lost in combat, and 6 more were damaged beyond repair. After the war, a number of 2,100-tonners served off Korea in the 1950s, and some even off Vietnam in the 60s. 32 were transferred to the navies of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Germany, Greece, Italy, Japan, Korea, Mexico, Peru, Spain, Taiwan, and Turkey.
If you like these types of videos, subscribe to our channel and get notification when we release new episodes. For more interesting military history content, check out our video library.